All right, we're going to jump into our discussion about creating surfaces in Civil 3D. And just before we jump in, just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, what do we want to learn about these things? Well, we need to understand how they work and what they're for, what they're supposed to do, first of all. But then also, of course, the button clicks are really, really important. Keeping in mind that, these things tend to migrate over time, and every time AutoCAD puts out a new version of their software, things might change just a little bit. So it might just require a little poking around if this video is a little bit out of date. I think we're going to be right up to date. We're using 2020 Civil 3D 2025 on this video. So let's go ahead and get to it. First of all, a surface is basically a blank thing. There's not really anything in the drawing area when you create a surface initially. But you have to create it. It's sort of like the canvas that you're actually going to paint on. So you have to sort of like get a surface into your drawing first. Obviously, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I haven't even started a drawing yet. But once we get a drawing opened up, we're going to create a surface, and then we're going to add point data to that surface to actually create the 3D undulations and all of the contour lines and things like that. So there is a type of surface that we're going to be using specifically. It's called a tin surface, TIN. That stands for Triangulated Irregular Network. And basically, this is what all surfaces in three-dimensional graphics are made out of. And that's true for video games. It's true for renderings in Revit. It's really true across the board. When you talk about triangles, they are the basis for all surfaces in 3D space. Even rectangles are made up of two triangles. You could think of a rectangle with a line from one corner to the opposite corner. It really consists of two triangles. So not to get too deep into it, but understanding that triangles are sort of the basis for all surfaces in 3D. All right, so a tin surface then is a triangulated irregular network. The surface itself, as we're going to see, can be created from two-dimensional or three-dimensional polylines that have X, Y, and Z data. And then the boundaries of the surface need to be closed polylines. And those are going to basically control the visibility of the portion of the surface that you're going to see in AutoCAD. And please don't be confused. When I use the term AutoCAD, I am referring to Civil 3D. It is essentially one application. And finally, before we get started, all of the files that we have associated with this demo should be downloaded ahead of time into a location that is easy to find. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and go out to the LMS and download the files that you need. You will need two files for this one. This is going to be, the first one is going to be surface.dwt, which is a template file. And the other file you need is a text file. It's a .txt file, and it's 1A, surface 1A PENZD. Those two files should be downloaded ahead of time so that you can find them easily. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start a new drawing, and we're going to be using that surface.dwt file. You will have to navigate to that, and I'm going to pause the recording so that you don't have to watch me navigate through all my files. But first, I'm going to go to the application menu, and I'm going to click New. That should give me the Browse window, and it's going to default someplace, but you need to browse to where you saved your DWT file. So here's my DWT file. I'm going to click on that and say Open. And make sure that whenever you start a new drawing based on a template, you remember to always save it right away. Remember that AutoCAD, unlike Revit, does not start saving backup files, doesn't do anything as far as saving your work until you've saved it at least once. So we're just basically in a drawing3.dwg right now. You might be drawing one. But let's go ahead and click that save icon. It's going to ask you for a location and a name. And let's just call this one Surf Practice. Let's keep it simple. Surfpractice.dwg is what we're looking for. So just like that, Surf Practice, save. And now we are safe, right? If something goes haywire, we don't lose all of our work. All right, first thing we're going to do, create a tin surface. A couple of different ways we can do that. On the Home tab, there is a Surfaces drop down. So on the Home tab, right over here, you can see Surfaces under the Create Ground Data panel. and under that you have just create surface. There are two ways we can do things in Civil 3D. Don't forget that we do have this tool space over here, and the prospector tab, remember, is the one that we're going to use to create new things. So if we wanted to create a new surface this way, we could just right click on surfaces and say create surface. It's exactly the same as doing it this way. So the type is going to be tin surface, as I mentioned before, that triangulated irregular network. And then the properties of this surface that we're creating. Now this is where the interface is quite a bit different than most of the other things you've seen before. AutoCAD doesn't really work this way, neither does Revit, neither does Creo, but we can put in all the information about this surface right here in this tabular format, and you can see that if we don't put a name in, it's just going to call it surface, and then it's going to put this next counter, which is basically just a numbering code, so that the first one obviously would be 1, and then you'd have surface 2, 3, 4, 5 after that if you created additional surfaces. We're only going to change two things. We're going to change the name and we're going to change the style. So let's change the name to ground. Let's just put a 1 after it. And then for the style, and this is basically just going to adjust how the surface looks once it's created. The style we're going to use for this one is points and border. So let's drop this down and change it, the builder button, to points and border. So let's look down through this list. There it is down near the bottom, points and border. Say OK. Now everything looks the way that we want it to, and we'll click OK. Now, as mentioned, we create the surface before we actually are going to see anything in the drawing area, right? But if you look over here at the prospector now, you can see that there's a plus symbol next to surfaces, and if you expand that open, there's that surface we just created. If we expand that open, you can see that there are a number of subheadings underneath ground 1 that we just created. There are masks, watersheds, definitions, and you can further expand all of this stuff to get to all the sort of sub-objects within that surface. So that's really it on creating the surface. We obviously need to add some data to the surface, so that's next. Before we do that though, we want to modify the surface a little bit just to kind of demonstrate how we can do that. So to modify this thing, we're going to go to, you guessed it, the Modify tab, and we're going to go to the Ground Data panel, and above that you're going to see Surfaces. So when we click on that, it automatically changes the ribbon, and you can see that it goes into edit mode. So this part is fairly similar to what we get when we edit something in Revit. And we have this little close icon that shows up. You sort of have the double menu now. You have the surface menu and the geolocation both highlighted. It's very similar to what happens in Revit when we edit something. Another thing to note is that we didn't actually have to pick the surface we wanted to edit. And the reason for that is there's only one. So AutoCAD just bypassed that step. But if there were more than one surface in this drawing, and there often are, we would be prompted to select the surface we wanted to edit, or we'd pick it from a list. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to add some surface data in the form of point data. So this was the other file you were to download from the LMS, and we're going to be looking for surface 1A PENZD.txt, which is basically a space delimited text file that has three-dimensional point data in it. In fact, let's take a minute and look at it. So I just browsed out to that text file, double-clicked on it, opened it with Notepad, and you can see that the format is basically space delimited. What does that mean? Well, data in this format can be separated. Each data point or column can be separated by a space, or it can be separated by a comma. You've heard of comma delimited before, probably. But this one is space delimited, and so you can see the format here. The PENZD, and I'm not going to be able to recall what D stands for, I apologize, but the P is the point number, that's the first column. The second one is the easting, so that's east of, prime meridian. The northing, north of the equator, that's the latitude. The fourth column of course, is the Z. That's the Z-axis, the elevation above sea level, or whatever 0 point we've set for this project. And then the D, just a double quote, I'm not sure what that is. But all the important information, the X, the Y, and the Z, is out here. So anytime you have data that has points with 3 coordinates, X, Y, and Z, we can plot that in AutoCAD. And Civil 3D has the native ability to pull in all sorts of different formats. PENZD is the one that we're using today. So we're going to click on the Add Data drop-down, and we're going to be looking for point files on this. So we'll click that, and down here near the bottom you can see point files is what we were looking for, so we'll go ahead and click that. Now, this interface is a little weird, so you just kind of have to get used to it. The good news is you'll see this repeated over and over again. Whenever we're looking for a file, it looks kind of like this. And go for the color. Always go for the color. That's one tip I can give you on Civil 3D. In this case, you can see the bright green cross right there. That means we're going to add files to this list. So obviously we can add more than one file to this list, but we're going to start off simple. Go ahead and browse to that text file that we just talked about and looked at, and we're going to add that to the list. So here it is, Surface 1A, PenZD. It's in the box. Click open, and now you can see it's added to the list. It's got a little green check mark next to it. We're not done. Don't click OK yet. We have not selected the correct format. AutoCAD's just not smart enough to figure out what format this thing is in, and you can see just in looking at this text box, it's not right. Yeah, we don't have it right yet. We have NEZ space delimited right now. We need the one that I mentioned, PENZD space delimited. Now you can see the point numbers in the correct column, the easting, the northing, the point elevation, and that D, I guess, is just the description. So we've chosen in this case not to put a description anywhere in this file, but if we did, it would be listed in this column right here. Now that we've got the file in there, we have the correct format listed, we can click OK. And you can see that there are a lot of points in that text file. Now, one thing I did not do when I opened the text file is scroll down through the list to show you how many hundreds of points have been collected in that file, right? But you can imagine collecting each one of these points probably took some time by some surveyors, right? Depending on the method that they used, but they had to collect a whole lot of points. But since they did, and those points had XYZ data in them, we can now just bring that right into AutoCAD/Civil 3D. So as you might imagine, those points are actually in 3D space. We're looking at it in plan view, straight down from above, and so you can't really see the depth of it. But if you take that view, and we can do the same thing in AutoCAD as we can in Revit, which is to hold the Shift key on your keyboard and hold the mouse wheel button and move your cursor around. And you can see that as I do that, I can kind of rotate around this thing, and you can see the elevation data now, that those points are not all on a flat surface. They're actually creating a curved surface. Okay, once you're done with that, you can go back to the top view, get it back to where we were. All right, so the next thing we're going to explore are things called break lines. We're going to add break lines to the surface, and break lines are basically what you could sort of think of as, you know, carving a path through this surface. So we're going to go ahead and thaw an existing layer. So this is where if you didn't use the correct template, you're probably not going to have this layer in there. So just make sure that you started with the correct template. And if you scroll up to the top, you open it up, you'll scroll up to the top, you'll see a few layers starting with an underscore. We're looking for the EG break lines one. We're just going to go ahead and click this little icicle or snowflake and thaw that layer. And you'll notice that this dark blue line showed up, 2 lines rather. And this is sort of representing a road that's sort of traveling across this surface. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the surface properties of this surface. This is the surface, right? If you click on the boundary, you can see that it selects everything. Same thing if you click one of the points. The whole thing is just one object. And so we're going to change the properties of that. And the way we're going to do that is just like you might expect. If you select it, you can either right-click then and say Surface Properties right here in the context menu, or you can go to the Surface Properties drop-down in the ribbon, and you have a couple other options up there then. But we're going to go to Surface Properties here, and it's going to open up this Surface Properties box, as you might expect. We're going to change the surface style, and right now it's points and border. We're going to change it to contours and triangles. So go ahead and just drop this down, and this is not necessarily changing what the surface is, it's just changing how it's displaying. So we'll go down to contours and triangles, select that. So nothing's happened yet, but this particular surface style, if we want to look at the properties of that style, we can do that with this button right here. So you can see this little drop down. We can either create a new style, we can edit the current style, and we can get in here and look at the style detail dialog, right? But we're just going to click this button right here closest to the drop down box right here. We're going to open up the properties of this thing, and you can see that information about this style, again, this isn't an object, this is a style that controls the display of objects is what we're looking at here. So the surface style, lots of things we can change as far as how that thing looks, but I want to go over to the display tab, and you can see that the various layers that each of these individual components are found on have different colors, and we can see that the contour lines, you have major contours and minor contours. We would think of a major contour as an index line, something we've talked about in the past. The minor contours are those 4 lines in between the index lines. So we're going to have a green line every 5th contour, and the rest of them are going to be red in this case. The triangles themselves are set to be white. So the color is going to be bilayer, right? That's the default. So it's going to assume the color of the layer that they exist on, in this case, is white. Okay, so that's just an observation. We're not going to change any of that stuff. We're just looking at it so we know what to expect once this stuff comes in. So for now, we're going to just go ahead and click OK. We're back to this. We've changed it. We changed the surface style to contours and triangles, and we say OK again. And now you can see that this thing looks a whole lot different. But as we already noted, the contour lines are green and red, and the triangles that make up the surface are white. Now something to note here is that these blue lines, they're still there, and these are not part of the surface currently, right? These are just polylines basically that are out there floating in space, and they do happen to coincide with, their elevations coincide with the surface more or less. But we're going to sort of try to use those polylines to create something of a road surface going across this. So again, let's not lose sight of the objective of this section of the demo. We were going to create break lines. So we started by turning on the layer that displays where those break lines should occur. Now we're going to go ahead and create those. So for that, we're going to expand open surfaces in Prospector. We have our ground 1, that's our surface that we're working with. Underneath that, we have definitions, which we'll expand out. And now we can see that there are break lines under the definitions. So we're going to add new break lines. We're going to right-click on break lines, and we're going to say Add. Just pull this out of the way a little bit. And let's go ahead and we'll leave all of these default, but we do have to give it a name. Let's just call it Road. And click OK. And now it's prompting us to select objects. I bet you know what we're going to do next. That's right. We're going to pick those 2 polylines. Make sure you don't accidentally click one of the triangles or contours. So we'll pick that one, and we'll pick that one. And now once we've selected everything we wanted, we can hit Enter. All right. Now, it's not real obvious what happened, but you probably saw the contours and the polygons change a little bit. And if you look closely, you can select one of the blue lines and you can see that the edges of the triangles have morphed a bit to coincide with where those blue lines are. Not every one, right? Like this one right here, it did not create a line exactly, but most of the polyline segments did sort of change a little bit to conform to that. And now you can sort of see that there is a flat surface sort of moving through that sloped surface. Now I will point out that I am basically following the tutorial that Civil 3D gives us. And if you want to step through the next steps where you can actually correct those irregularities where it's not lined up with the blue line, there is a further exploration section that we're not going to do in this demo, but I would encourage you to go out and take a look at that. This first run through, I realized there's sort of a lot to absorb. There's sort of a lot that we're talking about, but the idea here is just to get you familiar with the process, because a lot of the things we do in Civil 3D follow the same process. We're using tool space, the prospector tab, the settings tab. We're using the ribbon, and we're using all of those dialog boxes that keep popping up. We're going to keep doing that until it starts to feel a little bit normal. Okay, so we've got our surface. We're displaying contour lines and triangles. We've put a break line through there in the form of a road. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to trim this thing down, because oftentimes when you get survey data, you don't necessarily want to show the entire surface, right? The survey may have covered a wider area, or there might be data outside of the boundary that you're just not interested in displaying or seeing. So that's our next step. So we're going to add an outer boundary to the surface, and for that we've already got a polyline ready to go. Scroll back up to the EG area, the top of the list, scroll up there, and we're looking for one called boundary. It's abbreviated BNDY. It's the very first one here. So we're going to go ahead and thaw that to display it, and then we'll collapse that. And if you zoom in, it's not real obvious what happened, but if you zoom in, you can see this outer boundary, also blue, dark blue color, is what we're going to use to sort of trim this thing out. And just like when we modified this thing to add the break lines, we're going to go to the same place. We're going to go to Prospector, under Surfaces, there's our Ground 1 surface, and this is going to be under Definitions. We are looking for boundaries now. We're going to create a new boundary, so we're going to right click and say Add. See, we're already repeating things, so this should be getting very familiar to you already, hopefully. No, not yet, but it will. Let's call this this boundary, let's go ahead and call it Ground Outer. So we know that this is the outer boundary in case we need to create additional boundaries later. Just want to give it a name that makes sense and helps you tell it apart from other things you might create in the future. So we'll call it Ground Outer, and for this one, the type is going to be outer. And let's make this one non-destructive also. So we're going to go ahead and clear the, we're going to make it destructive by clearing non-destructive break line. That basically tells AutoCAD that it's okay to chop away things that are outside of that boundary. We do have to click OK at this point. It's not done because it's going to prompt us for that boundary line. Again, be careful. Make sure you see the right thing, highlight the correct thing. I'm going to go ahead and select that, and you'll notice that it went ahead and just did it for us. We don't have to click enter or anything like that because you can only have one boundary. So I knew we were done. So we had a whole bunch of stuff going on sort of in this bay right here. I don't know if it's a bay. I don't know if this is water, but for lack of a better term. And it carved it all out. Anything inside the boundary line sort of just went away. And, excuse me, anything outside the boundary line went away. Anything inside the boundary line remained. So you can kind of go around and see that. We can go ahead now and just turn that boundary layer. We can freeze it again so that we don't see that. But now we've sort of trimmed this thing down to just the areas that we're interested in, just the data that is legitimate that we surveyed. I should point out that the lines that we're crossing through this bay, those were generated based on the points that were put in, but there was not really any survey work that was done here. So it was just sort of trying to connect across from known data, but there would be a whole lot of unknown data happening in here. And so what we really want to do when we're surveying, when we take our survey back into the office and we generate a surface out of it, is we don't want to include anything that we're not sure about, right? So we wouldn't want those lines in there because they're not accurate, and someone down the road probably going to look at that and go, okay, the ground does this. Well, it probably doesn't. It probably does something completely different. We just didn't survey that. So we got to get rid of it. So as you can see, we are essentially done with this, but as you can see, this is a little bit hard to look at. If we just wanted to do a contour map, we could change the surface style and just display that. So let's go ahead and do that as our final step in this process. If we right click, again, if we right click on ground, or if we select the surface, right click and say surface properties, we're going to get this dialog back. We've been in here before. Remember, the surface style is what we're going to do to change what this thing looks like. It's not changing the object, it's just changing its display. So contours and triangles, let's go ahead and change that to just contours. And we can select our index line or contour interval. In this case, you have contours at 2 and 10. So the contour interval in this case would be 2 feet, but the index lines would be spaced at 10 feet. So let's go ahead and select that one, see what it looks like. Say OK. And now you can see that we've got a number of contour lines. And when we select a style, oftentimes what we're trying to do is get enough detail in the display that it helps us read what's going on, but not so much detail that it makes it impossible to see. So let's go ahead and try some other styles. We're going to go in a different way. We're not editing the surface style, we're just going to surface properties here. And so we went with 2 and 10. Let's look at something a little bit tighter together, like 1 and 5. Let's see what that looks like. Go ahead and say OK. And you can see that added a whole lot more information. And so if we were going to try to do something with this area right here, this is probably one that that would work well for us. Now there are ways to add additional styles, right? And so if 2 and 5 wasn't close enough together, we could further tighten those lines up by just creating another style if there wasn't one already. Okay, that's it for the surfaces. You should be able to move on to the exercise associated with this. You might have to feel your way through a couple of things. Don't panic. I'm sure that with enough patience and intuition, you can figure out how to complete all the steps of the exercise. And obviously, if you get stuck at all, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to send a follow-up video or just help you one-on-one. Reach out with any questions, and we'll see you all in class.